Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Tuesday edition of This is Revolution podcast. I get excited whenever that song plays. It does. At this point, I try to keep from jumping up and down like I usually do on stage because I don't want to get too sweaty before we get on air. Let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog. You may know him as a writer for Black Agenda Report and the newest member of the Miami DSA. We know him as the man who's not afraid to mow anyone. Pascal Robert.
You forgot to announce that the new one Black Alliance for Peace as well.
Yeah, that's not as funny as the other one.
It's all strategery, brother. It's all strategery.
And today we are going to be talking about we made a clip the other day about AI, and we're going to get even a little deeper than just AI, right? And I found our guest today via the Twitters. One of the people that listened to our show tagged me on a tweet thread our guest had. And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole of her very fiery Twitter. I saw the fire in her tweets and thought to myself, this is someone that would definitely get along with Pascal Robert. Very, very, very well. Definitely she tagged a tweet where she was calling out the movie Coded Bias. Have you seen Coded Bias, Pascal?
No, I don't watch popular culture.
Well, I mean, it's a documentary. It's not like it's a TV
I'm
show.
joking.
It's not like Blackish.
Why'd you have to mention that? I was in such a good mood.
Just mentioning Blackish puts you in a bad mood.
I don't like the what's his name? Kenya Barris.
Kenya Barris. Yeah. Kenya Barris is that documentary that I watched about how Air Jordans are the most revolutionary thing ever created, and Air Jordan saved hip hop in New York and everything else. Like, it was a horrible documentary. It was a long ass commercial for fucking Nike.
It's amazing how current Black popular culture and media culture in general is pushing so much bad Black politics from 1972. It's incredible.
Did you see what Toussaint said about you?
What did he say? Oh, for a second. No, that would not be for a pleasant. That would not make for a pleasant show or interview.
Amy Therese is not real. I'm gonna stick by that until Amy Therese comes to the house, slaps shit out of me. Till that happens, Amy Therese is that dude.
That dude.
Adam Proctor, is that his name? I'm gonna get calling people out by
I've been
name.
on Adam Proctor's show.
There you go. Then you've seen Amy Therese.
I don't think they're the same person, but okay. I've heard them appearing on the same show at the same time. So
it's not like we don't know how recording works. I could do that here. Do that. These are all the things.
Let's get to our guest.
You want to get to our guest? Okay.
Yes.
Let's just bring her in. I was going to play the clip. We don't need to play the clip. Let's just bring her in. Coming all the way live from Brooklyn, New York.
New York City.
Khadijah.
Hey, what a welcome. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you for agreeing to come on. Thank you for taking a strange person's DM.
Yeah, no problem. I love Twitter.
I don't think I've ever heard those words in ages. I was like, oh my God. So I was like,
there is kind of misogynoir harassment and the neo-Nazi kind of thing, but Twitter is also amazing for developing these social networks of communication. And I mean, this is how I found out about the This is Revolution podcast. There you go.
It's not. Look, hey.
Shout out to the sister
Khadijah. It always feels weird when you're sending someone a direct message ask them to come on your show because I was like, I hope this woman doesn't think I'm trying to hit on her. But she understood. You did not. You did not. So you're here, and I'm very glad you're here.
Well, I also have a podcast, the We Be Imagining podcast, and I be sliding in people's DMs.
Okay,
And it's funny, as you know, as somebody who's like identified as feminine, people don't generally think that I'm hitting on them. So I haven't had that thought. But yeah, I'm happy that y'all reached out. I'm excited to be on the show.
Awesome. Why don't we play the little video we did for the segment?
Don't say that. Somebody said Jason slid in the DMs. Don't say that. I write people very professional messages, or at least I think I do. What'd you say, Pascal?
So we can play the video montage.
Let's play the montage. Khadijah, I realize that you are probably too young to know any of these movies referenced in this montage. And if you know any of these movies referenced in this montage, I will walk to Brooklyn right now and buy you a donut.
My term for algorithmic bias. Algorithmic bias, like human bias, results in unfairness. However, algorithms like viruses can spread bias on a massive scale at a rapid pace. Algorithmic bias can also lead to exclusionary experiences and discriminatory practices. Let me show you what I mean.
We often see AI depicted in science fiction as a computer system gone rogue, one that has become more intelligent than the programmers who created it. With a mind of its own, it becomes a powerful digital villain that can't be stopped. In reality, AI's use is rather ubiquitous, but it should be equally as terrifying. The sinister nature of things like predictive policing has proven to create racist feedback loops with deadly effects. Does AI reflect the racism that exists in the modern world? If so, how can we confront such a reality if true? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution.
I watched sea beams glitter in the dark at the 10-house gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain.
Is that not the best part of Blade Runner? The tears in the rain scene with Rutger Hauer and Harrison Ford.
I do remember Blade Runner. I think that might be a little bit before our guest's time. Maybe not.
That came out in what, 81, 82?
So Khadijah's like, yo, these dudes are old.
So I wasn't conceived yet. I'm feeling like the Stranger Things Sun Ra like aesthetic though, particularly in the beginning. I'm really curious to hear like how the montage was inspired by AI and like the response to the Joy Buoyolimi's TED Talk in the beginning.
I remember her interview on Democracy Now! And I just remember Amy Goodman kind of like just so excited to talk to this woman. And I watched the whole, I spent quite a bit of time with her. And I was kind of like, I don't like, I guess that's fucked up, but I kind of like the fact that I can't be recognized. We were joking about this earlier when we were speaking. I was like, oh, this is kind of one of those advantages. And I kind of watched a little bit of the TED Talk. To be honest with you, it wasn't very interesting. So I haven't even trying to watch Coded Bias was actually kind of hard because, again, I didn't really find that all that interesting. I found we talked about some other books that I read, and there was actually another documentary I watched that Germany had done on AI that I found way more interesting than Coded Bias. But you're coming at it from a whole different angle, and those movies are movies where like computers have surpassed their human creators and are now running the show, if you will, going rogue. Tron, where they literally a man is who created a certain computer. The computer comes back and takes him inside of the computer. And Blade Runners, Harrison Ford running around killing android clones. I had used Terminator in another clip, so I didn't want to use Terminator, but that's kind of the main one, right? Skynet is what it's referenced so much when we talk about AI. So I was trying to be original, finding odd movies.
Jason really enjoys making those videos.
A little bit.
It's dope. I really appreciate it. I don't watch a ton of TV. I am now like scrolling back and trying to read more sci-fi, right? Because it's like a question of how do we define our imaginaries. But movies and mass culture is interesting in that it's a way for like society to process its anxieties and its concerns. And that's so much of the concern around AI, right? That there's going to be this singularity and it's going to surpass not just human intelligence, but our agency to really kind of mitigate the like potential harm that will incur. And I will say like my specialty or like my domain expertise is not facial recognition. And although I'm not like a TED Talk stan, I will like to give credit where credit is due. Joy Buyalimi and her co-author Timnit Gebru and Deb Raji, a PhD student that worked with them at the time. What that TED Talk was referring to was a paper called Gender Shades, where they were able to identify that the facial recognition was not able to recognize people with dark skin. So then comes the question, though, do we want to be recognizable to facial recognition?
Yeah.
Or should we just dismantle the whole damn thing?
And that's kind of like my point.
Or will we be punished for not being recognized? Will there be ancillary and tertiary costs to not being recognized as well? Which is something, is up for debate. I'm not an expert on this. But I actually wanted to commend you on your piece that I was reading, Calculating the Souls of Black Folk, Predictive Analytics in New York City Administration of Children's Services. And as I promised you, I would love for you to elaborate, as you talk about in your piece, on how the use of predictive analytics and child protective services become to a certain fusion during the Obama administration, and what is the consequence and the sentiment around that developing in that time. Can you elaborate a bit for us and the audience on that phenomenon and what it meant? Did we lose our guest?
Oh.
Sage. Oh, I'm
sorry
back.
There you go. Sorry.
Okay, I'm back. So I'll just step back for a second because a lot of people, the child welfare, or what some people call the family regulation system, is not at the forefront of public discourse in the way that mass incarceration in the form of imprisonment is. So a lot of people don't actually know how child welfare is a form of policing. And when we're saying a family regulation system, what that means is that not only are there child protective service investigations in which children could be removed and placed into a foster care, which could be into a foster home, a residential center, but also they run detention centers. And they also run child care vouchers. It varies based off of region, but it also functions a lot like the police. So recently when Ma'Khia Bryant was murdered by an agent of the state during the Derek Chauvin verdict being read. She was also in the custody of the state, and kind of as an entry point into this like tragic, a needless murder, we can see kind of all these layers of the war on poverty on top of each other, and like what produced the vulnerability for Micaiah. Because her mother was a home health aide, she was living in a neighborhood that in a part of Ohio where the school system was under a class action lawsuit for not giving kids with disabilities their services that they were required under IDEA. Ohio had some of the highest rates of removals and like the longest length of time for child separations before they're being reunited with their families. And so the family regulation system is a really intimate form of violence and policing that I guess is unique compared to standard law enforcement, and that it's intergenerational, that it's targeting children not just from when they are born, but from when they are fetuses, and particularly Black women, Indigenous women, disabled women, trans women are uniquely subjected to these forms of surveillance. Now, fast forward with the predictive analytics, a lot of times when people want me to talk about AI, predictive analytics, or what is also known as automated decision-making systems, they want me to tell that story about the white teacher who called the cops on the kid with the toy gun, and then the police came and child services got involved. They want like all of this evidence of Black harm and like diversifying these videos of the lynchings that we see circulating around social media. And I basically refuse to do this because on some level, we do know that child welfare is harmful. Like at the very same time, even before the Obama era, during the Clinton era, when we have the end of welfare as we know it, the height of the Clinton crime bill in 1994. In 1997, we have the Adoption and Safe Families Act separating children. What else do we have? The Home Alone the multi-million-dollar comedy franchise about the white kid being left at home in a family with no family. So I think that we're all very aware about how like racist and terrible the system is. Fast forward.
Can you please go? This is very important, and I appreciate you so much.
Yeah,
talk about those two policies that come out of the Clinton administration and their effect on child protective services. Please, if you don't mind, if you can just do me this dispensation and just elaborate on that a little bit, please.
No problem. And I'm sorry, I know that I'm giving a lot of information, but it's hard to understand how the technologies operate without understanding like the larger political context. And then there's so little that we know, or that like the larger public is given information about the actual child welfare system. So we have a few things. The one is that something that people are more familiar with, particularly given the current president of the United States was one of the authors of the Clinton crime bill that increased mass incarceration. But in the midst of that, we also have Clinton ending welfare as we know it, because the ruling class also has within its own incentive abolition, right? And so it's dismantling a huge part of the social safety net right at a moment. And Dorothy Roberts, who's written Killing the Black Body, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, writes a lot about this. Right at the moment that Black women are demanding inclusion into AFDC, which is what welfare was called at that time, that's when we see welfare and social safety net things becoming more punitive. And so we have this mythology of the welfare queen who's like out here buying fish and lobster with her food stamps. And then we end welfare as we know it. People are forced to work for their welfare benefits. There's a time limit placed on how long people can be on welfare. And at the very same time, in 1997, we have the passage of the Adoption and Safe Families Act, also known as ASFA. And what this did was create time limits, increased time limits that expedited for kids who were in care. If they were left in care for, I believe it was initially 18 to 22 months, or it could be within 6 weeks. If it was considered abandonment, they would have their parental rights terminated, also called TPR. And so what this did was it created multiple generations of legal orphans. And Black children were disproportionately had their parental rights terminated. They were disproportionately left in care without a disposition of adoption or any kind of like place into independent living. And it really decimated our communities. And of course, in the context also of like the crack epidemic and other things that were going on.
Phenomenal. More reason to despise the neoliberals. More reason to despise them.
You think? But the names of these programs don't sound so sinister, and I think that's the problem. Like when you think of the Violence Against Women Act, which is a big part of the 1994 crime bill, and is a reason why when you put a microphone in front of all these politicians, especially Democrats, the first thing they say that were there to sign the bill that are still in office, Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, I believe Clyburn was around for that, wasn't he? 94.
He was in office.
They always say the Violence Against Women Act. That's why we signed that bill, and that's why we stand by it today.
Well, two books that I just wanted to recommend real quickly. One is Naomi Marikawa's "When Liberals Built Prison America." Phenomenal book. I love. She's like coming for blood. I really appreciate it. And then the second book is, although her politics are like not that great in the present, but this book is phenomenal, is Elizabeth Hinton's The War on Poverty, which is making the argument that kind of the criminalizing of the social safety net was not just additive to mass incarceration, but it's central to understanding how this happened. And that's why people keep talking about the family regulation system. So it's not just how it separates and takes people away, but how it manages your time, your sense of space, where people live, how do you relate to each other over generations.
And what's real interesting is how people are so for incarcerating parents or punishing parents. We have a thing here in San Francisco, and I will say this: I haven't been out in the city since the pandemic, so we call San Francisco the city. I'm a Bay Area native. Sorry, Khadijah. It's not Manhattan. It's San Francisco.
Well, you got better weather. I'm not mad. I just don't know how to drive.
But there was a thing going on where these dudes were having women go out with a child, and maybe you have the same thing in New York, begging on our subway, which is called BART, and they'd be begging with the kid. And I worked in the city, so I would see these women a lot. I'm like, that's a different kid. Oh, it's the new hustle. Okay, I got it. And the first thing people would literally yell is, "Where's child services? Why don't they take this kid away?" I was like, wow, that's heavy. There's a lot. What did the people say? There's a lot to unpack there. Like, just to want to snatch a kid up like that, if it's his mom or if it's not his mom, says a lot about how society views poverty in general and criminalizing it.
So Khadijah, carry us over into how this translates into the Obama presidency. You can take us through Bush if you want as well, or take us directly to Obama in terms of predictive analytics, how these horrendous qualities fuse together to create this horrific cauldron of child displacement.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll try not to say things so densely, and maybe you can stop me and ask me different questions. But I'll just
that's
highlight.
Okay, Khadijah. That's totally okay, because
bring
we're gonna
bring
drain
it,
the whole hour out of you, and if we can get extra time for our bonus Patreon half, we're gonna let you finish those long sentences on the other side. So,
okay, I appreciate that. I mean, one is, I'll just lift up the point that you made, is that we live in a deeply, deeply carceral society. And so this is not just imprisonment, right? This is children getting suspended from school. And of course, Black children, again, have the highest rate of suspension from preschool. This idea of timeouts. We're always thinking about separating and disciplining. And I believe Dorothy Roberts' pin tweet right now, shout out to Twitter, is something along the lines of people are more worried about Black kids being respectful. And that's so heavy and that's so real, right? So this is this culture, but we also have this turn to kind of a rehabilitative model, and so this is what's happening. So a lot with child welfare now, they're saying, they themselves even say that they want to abolish child welfare. They acknowledge that there's all this portion, and they need to better figure out how to allocate services. And this is happening in tandem. Social conversation around bias and racist discrimination, but not in the analysis that we're talking about, more like the diversity and inclusion corporate seminar kind of thing. And so I think that what you're referring to in the paper, which is forthcoming in the Columbia Law and Race Journal for a special edition celebrating the 20th anniversary of Dorothy Roberts' book, Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare. What I was referring to is with DJ Patel, who at that time was the head of the head of technology for the Obama White House, is having a conversation with Gladys Carrion, who at that moment was the commissioner of the New York City Administration of Children's Services, otherwise known as ACS. And he poses the question to her, how do you feel about predictive analytics being used in your New York City child welfare system? And she says, it scares the hell out of me. We are a service that predominantly serves Black and Latinx families, and I'm worried that this will increase stigma and it will further decimate these communities. And about 3 months later, she steps down. At that time, the reason that is given is because there's these two high-profile murders of children whose parents were being under investigation by the New York City Administration of Children's Services. And following that, we saw what we call a foster care panic, which is like a sudden increase in removals following the high-profile death of a child. And then the new commissioners appointed David Hansel, who immediately upon his appointment states that he is going to roll back a lot of the decisions from Gladys Carrion, and he wants to return to ChildStat, which is built off of the NYPD's CompStat, or this kind of policing as an information science business. He wants to implement predictive analytics and enhance all of the data collection and what he calls like quality improvement reviews, but ostensibly are forcing the nonprofit agencies that are contracted out by the New York City Administration of Children's Services to manage foster care services to be collecting more data and build up their technical capacity. So I'll kind of pause there if you have more questions, and I can continue.
Did that answer your question there, Mr. Question Guy?
This is incredible, man. This is incredible. This is incredible, man. I mean, it just illustrates that, what I just showed, this is Revolution podcast, called the 50-year counter-revolution, which starts pretty much after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the rise of the Nixon administration, that the 50 years from that point to today is a counter-revolution against all of the attempts to use the New Deal Civil Rights Coalition to bring back both racial and material benefits to working class, poor, and Black people. And at the same time, there's a bipartisan consensus really that exacerbates under Jimmy Carter, gets horrible under Reagan, but gets even worse under Clinton, continues through Bush and Obama, where both flanks of capital, the right flank and the left flank, are grounding poor and working class Americans who are disproportionately Black and brown per capita to powder. And at the same time, people are saying things like, oh, well, Bill Clinton is the first Black president. Oh, I love Obama and Michelle. And it just illustrates how badly the consciousness of American people have been duped with this Trojan horse-like politics that has been a bipartisan agenda that is the friend of no one except the elites who are just basically trying to line their pockets. And every time I see examples of us being able to expose that reality on this show, I feel that it's our duty to illustrate how much this is a two-party racket and they are not interested in protecting your interests at all.
Nah, I 100%, I 100% support that. And kind of like what I'm trying to do with my work is, I know that, I say that I am an abolitionist. I legitimately want to dismantle the system. But a lot of times, among the activist groups who are not out here worried about electoral politics, who are really on the front lines, what I say to them is that we cannot dismantle the system if we don't understand the full expanse of the system. And a lot of it is because we have demonized poor people, because we have demonized indigenous, and I also don't want to create, there are Black indigenous people, so not to say that indigenous people are not Black, but indigenous Native American people on reservations, instead of saying, what are the conditions that produced highest rates of fetal alcohol spectrum or highest rates of unemployment, COVID-19 transmission, HIV, all of these things. Instead of looking at the conditions, we've transposed them into risk factors that are inherent to them as people, which are then baked into these data sets, which then, when you're using an algorithm to manufacture insights based off of the historical biases that are baked into that data, you just produce kind of more pathology rather than looking at kind of systemically what's happening. But just to be clear, like what predictive analytics is that it's taking, so one, and this came out, this is not even from my research, PBS NewsHour did a special on this, Virginia Eubanks, Automating Inequality, how high-tech tools profile, police, and punish the poor looked at this. The pilot model of predictive analytics in the child welfare system was in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, and very specifically there, they were using it in these call centers to decide which of the calls, so people, just how you would like call 911, you can call this phone number to report a case of child maltreatment or abuse, and this was being determined to who should be screened in and screened out, and ultimately whose child should be removed. The number one risk factor was whether the mother had child welfare history. So
wow, say it again for people in the back.
The number one risk factor was whether the mother had child welfare history. That means if she was investigated in the past, or if she herself or themselves were in the foster care as a child.
And that will be the first indicator of what exactly she would receive as treatment?
No, so they have, something like 200 different data points that they're analyzing. But the number one predictive factor that is like publicly available, you can look on PBS NewsHour and see it, and also Virginia Eubanks' book, was if the mother had child welfare history. The other major data points include like poverty, right? But they don't know if you have food in your fridge. What are they looking at? They're looking at, have you used SNAP, otherwise known as food stamps? One of the risk factors is, does the parent have a mental illness? It does not know whether you have a mental illness. What are they looking at? They're looking at, have you used your Medicaid card at a Medicaid clinic for mental health services? And so a lot of times we hear the term evoked trauma, that we need to reduce adverse childhood experiences, that it correlates to all of these poor outcomes. But the original Kaiser Permanente study that was evaluating adverse childhood experiences was done on a population that was predominantly white, predominantly married, with over a college education in the suburbs, right? And this is not who we see reflected in the child welfare roles. They're not identifying or interested in trauma. They're interested in targeting a very specific vulnerable population that's utilizing city services.
LME said something interesting. Basically, any attempt your mom made to get help from the system tags you as a risky for negative factors.
Oh, yeah. Khadijah, are you still there?
Yeah.
Can you hear us? Did the deep state get you?
Yeah, yes, I can hear. Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you now. It sounded like the deep state got you. We were a little worried.
No,
you're okay. You're back. Okay.
I was saying not just if your parent was looking for services, but if she was looking for public funded services. And so not everybody is uniquely available to being investigated by the child welfare industry. It is people who are relying on state and city services.
And I do want to point out in your piece, you noted that, they can check on people whenever they want to do, and you're using ultimately counselors, social workers in a policing fashion, which is something that we always talk about on this show. And people always talk about wanting to replace cops with social workers. I'm like, so you want social workers to be police officers? Like you really want them to do the same thing as police officers. You just want to be a little nicer about it.
This varies by region, but most of them are not. This is like a big misunderstanding. Most of these people are not social workers. They're specifically caseworkers. And where that term, even caseworkers, comes from is the turn of the 20th century, when you have kind of brick and mortar poorhouses, and the caseworkers were detectives investigating this case of whether you were worthy of social services. Like, the role was never designed to help people. It was about mitigating like risk for the state about not spending too much money on unworthy poor people.
Now, can I get you to expand a little bit on the term you used in that paper, digital poorhouse? So poorhouses were a real thing. I believe the last one in the States closed in the 80s. You have a term you would call it digital poorhouses. What is the digital poorhouse?
So that exact concept and term comes from your Virginia Eubanks book, the one that I keep mentioning. And I keep mentioning this book because there's a significant body of work from Black women, including Dorothy Roberts, around the history of the child welfare system, around the social safety net, but there's very little present day work on predictive analytics in the child welfare system, and Virginia Eubanks's work is one of the few. And in that book, she has a chapter dedicated to the digital poorhouse. And what this is saying is that, I mean, interestingly, we don't have brick and mortar poorhouses per se, but we definitely still do have residential centers and these kind of centralized facilities where we dispose of the unwanted, but they're largely in rural areas out of plain sight. Unlike kind of this turn of the 20th century, they were very central to urban planning and very visible. Like in New York City, we had them on, I want to say Roosevelt Island, the workhouse, the Alms House, the insane asylum, Blackwell Prison. So now they're more in rural areas. But the point about the digital poorhouse is what she says is that what was unique about the brick and mortar poorhouse is that you have different racial and ethnic groups geographically co-located together and building kind of the rainbow coalition and these cross-racial solidarity, because you're sitting next to each other and you're seeing my struggle, your struggle on site. With the digital, it preempts that kind of geation. So you're being identified through kind of algorithms running in a data set, classified and sorted and distributed before you ever interact with each other. So what that could look like in real time is like if you want to apply for welfare right now, most people would be applying online. You're entering in your demographic information. It's taking your social security number, your location, maybe not just your address, but the location of even where you're applying, various factors, and sending you this, where, or the other. And so it can kind of predetermine kind of even where you move to finish applying for those services. So you don't have that same kind of ability to have a shared solidarity.
That's
interesting. Interesting. So back to the predictive analytics. Can you give us maybe a visual in terms of numbers as to how much the predictive analytics increases the kind of funneling of persons, particularly brown and black and poor white as well, into this kind of vicious cycle once it starts to get implemented? Can you elaborate on that? Is that something you can discuss with us?
Sure. I mean, I would say that we're in an intermediate place right now. So historically, they've used a strategy called selective incapacitation, where they intensely surveil certain populations, but it's very specific. It's not just if you are black. It is if you are black and you're disabled and you have like an income not just below the federal poverty line, but you're relying on forms of public services that have more intensive surveillance. So a lot of times people will say, the majority of investigations are due to neglect, and neglect is a culprit for poverty. But for me, that doesn't in and of itself explain the like kind of racial stratification that we see in child welfare removals and investigations. So for example, in New York City, African Americans per capita often have a higher income than Chinese Americans for a variety of reasons. And so what I noticed is if you look at, say, Medicaid, which is like the lowest level of social services, that lowest level meaning the lowest amount of surveillance, you see kind of an even range of people's racial demographics proportional to who is in the city. Then you look at food stamps, it starts to slightly change. Then you look at cash assistance and it becomes increasingly Black and Puerto Rican. Then you go to the shelter system and it's almost exclusively Black and Puerto Rican. And that's like who we see represented in the foster care roles. And so when they're doing predictive analytics, if you're relying on this historical data, you're constantly focusing in on this kind of deep data set in the sense that it's racial, that it's intergenerational, but like bounded because it's the same group of people. So what begins to shift and what we see with predictive analytics, and you have this moment when David Hansel comes in, is that they say, hey, we want to move from a removal-based foster care system to a prevention services foster care system, because removal is so traumatizing and it's racist. And so we want to prevent people from being removed, which is kind of like a wild concept if you think about it. It's like Philip Morris coming out here and being like, we want to prevent people from smoking the thing that we're producing. Like they want to prevent children from being separated by themselves. And what happens at that moment is that they want to expand the population of people that they have access to. And so what they're doing in predictive analytics, the main thing is not the algorithm. The main thing is not the technology. It's a very specific thing. and it's called it's modifying the interagency memorandums of understanding, otherwise known as MOUs. What this means is that they want, so one of the risk factors is, are you a single parent? They might not know that inherently, but now if you modify the memorandum of understanding between the Child Welfare Agency and the Department of Health and Vital Records, which has all the birth certificates, you can now scan all of those birth certificates and identify which one only has one parent listed. And so this is what we're seeing is beginning to change. Is that the breadth of and expanse of the data that they have access to is larger, and they're bringing that into these machine learning systems crave data, and so they're bringing a lot more data in, and they're saying it explicitly. So in that paper, I talk about Ravi Shroff, who at the time was a researcher at the City University, at the NYU and City University of New York. We're working together, and he says, look, we have a couple 100,000 records in your data, but like 911, they get like over 1 million calls a year. And look at Facebook and Google and Amazon. They have hundreds of millions of searches, all throughout the year. I can't remember the exact number. And that's the goal. So they want to have way more access to way more people to process that information. And then going back to the digital poorhouse, to classify, sort, and move you across space and identify your children for removal or investigation or prevention.
So what it is that it's not basically that these mechanisms are saying, okay, we're going to target the Black people. They're going to target people who have certain, basically vectors of poverty signs in their background. And because, capitalism requires Black people disproportionately are rendered to the reserve army of labor, hence poverty, it's going to disproportionately affect poor Black and Latino people. So in other words, the conundrum of capitalism disproportionately pushing particularly Black, Latinos, and indigenous people of color into the reserve army of labor creates a vicious cycle upon which these digital technologies look at that fact and say, since the people of this background with these particular signposts have had these problems before, we think there's a higher likelihood that those types of people might have them again. So it's really about a combination of class that intersects with race. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I'll say two things, and I'm also looking at people's comments in the chat section. And so, 2 points. So one important way to think about race and all the different factors that marginalize people, right? Like the disability, reliance on public services, is that the UNHCR Special Rapporteur to the United States a couple of years ago, when he was looking at these kind of automated decision systems that are adopted by the public sector, including coordinated housing entry in LA, right? Is he said they experiment on the most marginalized people before generalizing to the rest of the population. And so I think it's worth thinking about it on like a temporal level, because they're not going to go for Henry Louis Gates first, right? They're not even going to want to go for you because you have like a podcast, that's not a good look. Like once in a while they do, and you see an article about it. They go for the wrong person.
Gates out of this.
They want to go for like the 17, not just the 17-year-old parent, but the 17-year-old parent who has, why is the mother having a child welfare history a number one risk factor? They don't have any kind of, they might not have the same roots in the community and social kinship network to support them if they're falsely accused of something. Who's the witnesses? What resources do they have to fight? So they're going to experiment on the most marginalized people, one, before generalizing to the rest of society. We don't know everything that they're doing. And what I try to say in the paper is I can only go based off the publicly available data. And that publicly available data includes, this is a federal order to modify interagency memorandums of understanding. It does vary by state, but this is all publicly available information. And so I really encourage people to look up. You can find it on the Administration for Children and Families, which is the federal level. You can find these bills, and you can find for your state exactly how they're implementing it, because it definitely does vary by region, but this is kind of the overall shift that we'll be seeing over the next decade or so, and since the Obama administration.
Since the Obama administration, this is a whole, wow. So, Khadijah, I really applaud the work that you do. This is so ultimately important to demonstrate how the state, both flanks of the state, are trying to punish poverty in America. Can you tell us some of the comrades, allies, co-conspirators you have that are in this fight who are doing what you believe is a good job to expose this? Because I'll be frank, most people do not know this information. They're not aware of it.
Khadijah on the show now. Do you see why I, as you young people say, slid into her DMs?
People do not understand that we've had a 30-year war on the poor in this country that's been, bipartisan, largely led by Democrats as well. And, who can we look to? I mean, how can we give more platform to your work or those who are doing work like yourself? Are there organizations involved? Are there think tanks? Are there collectives of people? Are there organizations, meet spaces? How can we magnify the voices that are putting these atrocities on blast?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I mean, honestly, I don't know, people are just super anti-Black. A lot of times people are like, oh, Khadijah, you're so smart. I'm like, no, I just code switch very effectively. Those people that are deemed to be ignorant and that we dispose of, like that baby mama cursing people out in the child welfare agency, like that person that's standing in line and, probably now standing on digital line to apply for food stamps. Like these people got the truth. Like you said, there's been a war going on out here, and we don't often provide platforms to the people that are on the front line because they don't meet the criteria for Black excellence and Black uplift or really into our political agendas. And I say that this is not directed to you guys, but I'm just saying,
I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying
we hate those people too.
No, I'm agreeing with you wholeheartedly as someone that's actually worked with the unhoused and lived amongst them for some time. The nonprofit world is a we can do a whole show on the nonprofit world, but talking about how people are navigated through not just the nonprofit world, but the programs that you have to deal with, like food stamps, like Social Security, like disability, the child welfare system. You know what I mean? Like seeing this up front and seeing how hard it is and how much judgment people get. Again, back to the story of the woman with the baby that, probably isn't hers still, but everybody, and as somebody said in the chat, pointing fingers and being like, why can't someone take this kid away? We are so quick to be punitive in this society. A lot of it has to do with the systems that are set up.
A lot of it has to do with the fact that the ideological superstructure of this country is designed to dispose of people who are not 1% adjacent, quite frankly, or at least can pretend that they are.
My apologies. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was just going to say that I think what's unique about doing like advocacy, activism, or whatever around the child welfare system, family regulation system, is that I feel like there's at least some degree right now. If you hear that your cousin or you see on TV somebody's getting arrested, you're like, oh, this is racist. This is the empire like controlling people. A lot of people, like when I say neighborhoods are hyper targeted, there's a neighborhood in Brooklyn. It's called Brownsville, East New York. 1 out of 3 children under the age of 18 have been investigated by the New York City Administration of Children's Services in Brownsville, East New York. And this is according to their data from the New York City Administration of Children's Services, right? And so many people in that neighborhood that I've spoken to, that I've worked with, feel like, well, maybe it's about my family. Maybe it's about the Johnsons or the Davises or the, whatever it is. They have internalized how they have been labeled and categorized as something that's immediately pathological about them, especially because this hits the most intimate part of people's lives, their relationships. And if you feel abandoned by your mother, by your sibling, and you don't know the whole systematic way that your family, your community is targeted, you have no analysis to grab hold on. And I think for those of us that are on the front lines of movements or trying to build alternative media, that we have a responsibility to provide that kind of space and that like analytic lens so people can detach from feeling like it's an individual judgment. And then the last thing, just to be specific, because I'd be real remiss if I didn't shout them out, is shout out to Movement for Family Power, which is a Black woman and another woman of color who started a national child welfare policy institute think tank that's trying to reimagine child safety. And to my friend, my comrade that I love, Joyce McMillan. You can find her on all the different social media things called JMAC for Families. And there definitely is a burgeoning movement, and there has always been one. I mean, I try not to give all of these examples of how Black people are subject to harm, because a lot of times we only hear that and we don't hear about all the ways people are continuing to resist it. But there's also always been underground, like Black midwives and Black doulas. It's a reproductive justice movement. And so, yeah, despite everything, we continue to exist and resist and like be in community with each other.
But being that you're in an urban environment like New York, which has a disproportionate amount of Black people who are segmented for this type of treatment, is it fair to say that when you go into the Appalachians, when you go into the kind of like country backwoods parts of the country, is there a similar reflection of this type of treatment in non-Black spaces in America as well? Or do you think this is an urban phenomenon that really just targets particularly Black, brown, and Native American people?
Absolutely. I mean, this is why I think it's important to look regionally. New York City is actually very unique, and I'm saying New York City specifically is very unique in that it's almost exclusively Black. It's something like 60-something% Black, 30-something%. They say Hispanic, but like what we find is it's often Puerto Rican. But the way they even count race in their whole system is very strange. And like Black and Hispanic are mutually exclusive categories. So we feel that they're probably undercounting Black people. But this is unique. So Black and Indigenous people are disproportionate in the rest of the country. But for example, in Allegheny County, disproportionately is poor white people who are targeted by child welfare. And so I don't want to say that it's only Black. And I would say also, a lot of people think about the Dakota Access Pipeline. They don't realize that the Lakota Law Group, the other major initiative that they had besides the Dakota Access Pipeline, was ICWA and keeping Indigenous children with the tribes themselves. So it does vary by region.
I can only speak anecdotally, Pascal, but my first time doing a show in Butte, Montana, I met probably 4 women in the venue that were celebrating getting their kids back from child services.
And these were Black folk.
No. If you can find me
There's
a Black
lot
person,
of white people that are being targeted. Just not white middle class people in New York City.
No.
But I would say even in Philly, like in major urban centers, there are definitely white people represented. New York is unique in that it's almost exclusively not white.
Incredible.
No, this is I don't know. You're bringing back hearing you talk is bringing back a lot of memories of being at the shelter. One of the women that were there, I remember she was telling me her story on how she got there. She was a prostitute and was working the streets and saw a car that looked shady, as she said, and she walked away and didn't take the date, and the dude shot her. And because she got shot, she lost her kid. And it took her, I want to say, 8 years just to get visitation again, to try to get her child back.
I mean, it's everywhere though. Like, this is the thing. I think we have to reflect as a community why it's so hidden. I mean, Malcolm X was a foster kid. Khalif Browder was a foster kid. Erica Garner was a foster kid. This is really something that surrounds all of us. And for a lot of parents of children with disabilities, it's like always a threat, even for white people. When you have kids with severe disabilities, you're questioning that doctor, you're at risk of having your child removed or at the very least being investigated. And so, I think that they're very skilled in what algorithms allow you to do is really carefully identify and classify people. And so it's not as visible to everyone else. Stop and frisk, at least it was happening on the street. So you could see kind of that it was happening to the community. That caseworker coming in behind closed doors It's not visible to all of us. And, people are ashamed and they think that it's them.
Well, let me ask this question. Can we get you for at least another half hour?
Yes, can I have like a 5-minute? Can I get a 5-minute recess?
Of course. Of course. I just want to know if we can steal you for a little bit longer. I know you have a family to attend to. I'm hoping that people are at least asleep at this point, so we can steal you.
No, my kids are asleep, but I could use like a snack real quick.
Yeah, that's fine. We usually take like 15-minute break.
Okay, cool. I'm with it. Thank you for having me.
No, this has been wonderful.
This has been amazing. So we're gonna send you the link, and we'll be back in what 5, 10? What Jason? How much you?
Yeah, I'll send her a link. We'll be back 7:15. You can come on and check. So if you already know the deal, party people, then you know to become a patron. This is going into the bonus patron only after hours segment, where we're going to start asking Khadijah solution-based questions. What do you think the answer is? Don't you dare answer that now. We're putting that answer behind a paywall. There's the link. Patreon.com/Bitterlake Presents. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, M2 Salt in the chat, for filling in. Our moderator, John Ross, apparently had his second shot of Moderna, and it put him on his ass. He said he'll be back Saturday. Thursday, we'll be talking to producer and director Billy Mintz of the movie The Guardians. If you've seen the LeBron James produced I Care a Lot on Netflix, it's based off Billy Mintz's documentary, The Guardians, about guardianship, mainly in Nevada, where the elderly get taken advantage of. They get robbed and thrown into old folks' homes, and a lot of them come out in body bags. It is a horrible story that horrible LeBron James movie. I want you to think of this every time you think of LeBron. I'm mad at him for several reasons. The movies he produces and hitting that 3 to beat the Warriors. So, that being said, Khadijah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Khadijah.
I'm going to send you the link. Don't hang up.
Thank you for having me again. I appreciate it.
No, this is.
Yes, check out We Be Imagining. Thank you for whoever put that in the chat.
I thought I linked that stuff in the description. I literally stole it from that site, all the information about you, because since you are not an internet celebrity, it's hard to get information about you. So thank you very much, Khadijah, and we are out.